Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Fagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internets, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human, Mr. Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing tonight?
Doing great. I'm glad I'm back from our hiatus. As it were.
As it were. I feel like this is more of a podcast just to kind of like check in. Like, how are you in Chelsea? Like, how are things?
Yeah, the kids are great.
Great. Is it still going to school? Like,
yeah. The dad took care of that thing, so it's not contagious. So we're good.
That's important. You know, you don't want to be at the Center for Disease Control too long. Otherwise, like, you start getting a nickname, and then the family gets a nickname, and things just get. God, in every boy's life, there's a summer of 2012. Well, welcome to Norse Code. We've got a couple things we can talk about. We are, of course, in the middle of the news desert of the preseason, but we've got a couple things we can talk about at least. And just want to thank you guys so much for listening and supporting the show over the years. If you enjoy the show and hear value in what we produce twice a week during the regular season, we're on a bit of a 2 to 6 week thing at the moment, but I promise that'll catch up. That'll pick up right away when training camp is about to begin. So we'll begin our weekly shows once again. Thank God. But if you enjoy the show, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and you can donate to the show there. Just help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, help pay a couple of bills for us to keep the show ad-free. Or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well. Or you can do something as simple as forwarding the tweets or retweeting or sending out on Facebook, social media, whatever. Just tell a friend about Norse Code, please, especially during the off season. I beg of you. It's so quiet. It's you know.
Please, something happen.
Something happen. I'm not asking for Kyle Rudolph to get a Dewey or something. I just need some form of Vikings news other than like Vikings Twitter drama. Like, I need something. So, with all of that said, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. We can talk a little bit about some camp battles to watch, but I feel like the big news, if there is big news over the past month or so, it actually involves our long snapper.
The
long snapper battle. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, I mean, most people have already kind of rehashed the news already, but President Donald Trump reversed a policy that his administration put in place in 2017 that restores the prior policy regarding Department of Defense football players, and I think just kind of all athletic players seeking, coming from an academy going to a professional league, that allows them to concurrently serve their commitment to the armed services as well as play professional sports. So that policy, I think, was put into place. It was sometime during the Obama administration. It was first in 2017 under Secretary Jim Mattis, and then it has been since reversed once more. One suspects that the Vikings saw this coming. I don't know how, but cool that they seem to know that. And if you draft a long snapper, I imagine that the presumption is that you'll keep that guy and not cut the guy that you could have like spent a pick getting like Stanley Morgan or whatever. So that pretty much clears the way for Austin Cutting, who will, I'm not sure how, I think it's basically like serve on weekends or something like that, but it's not like National Guard. But it clears the way for Austin Cutting to play for the Vikings while fulfilling his service commitment to the Air Force. So he's probably your long snapper.
Well, I suppose that answers that question then. Yeah, so that is the big news. We'll see you guys in like 2 weeks.
Biggest news, yeah. All right. Thanks for stopping by.
Exactly. Let's talk about some camp battles to watch. I mean, we definitely have the wide receiver 3 position, which has gotten a lot of talk, especially on our show, over the past couple of months, as to kind of what to expect and whether or not Treadwell is expected to pick it up, or if it's going to end up being Beebe or something like that. There was at least a couple pictures of Chad Beebe taking punt return, like receiving punt returns as well. So is there anything that we should be watching as far as the wide receiver 3 goes?
Yeah. So, and I think as we go over these camp battles, it's like we kind of have to acknowledge that these are the conversations we've been having all off season. So like, I don't want to rehash things too much, but a quick recap of what's been happening at wide receiver 3. Jordan Taylor was initially taking the third wide receiver snaps. He's the guy that they signed from the Denver Broncos, who had to miss last year because of an injury, but played in 2017. He's 27 years old. So, it's not, you didn't not hear of him because he's young. He's actually been around for a while, but he's always kind of impressed, for the Broncos in the preseason and in training camp. And apparently that was enough for Kubiak to kind of give them the go-ahead and grab him for the Vikings. But he'd been taking wide receiver 3 snaps, but he again, and he's had a history of injury problems, he again gets injured. And so then Brandon Zylstra, the guy from Concordia, Minnesota, that played in the CFL for 2 years, was like the CFL's first or second leading receiver for both of those years. He was taking wide receiver 3 snaps, and that was kind of interesting because when they were both on the roster together at the end of last year, him and Chad Beebe, it was Beebe who was actually taking snaps from scrimmage and Zylstra who was taking snaps on special teams. But you know, that's kind of notable that they didn't put Beebe out there. And then he gets injured too, and so then Beebe plays as the wide receiver 3. And so most notably, Laquan Treadwell hasn't really been taking wide receiver 3 snaps. Now, because they do heavy rotations in camp at wide receiver more than anywhere else, you will see him catch passes from Kirk Cousins with Dalvin Cook in the backfield and the first-team offensive line out there. But the first rotations are never taken by him, either in the drills or in 11s. So it's pretty unlikely that he's in real contention for that battle. I think the next person up is Dylan Mitchell. And then from there, you could say, you know, it's Treadwell. Treadwell has been running with the 2s fairly consistently, so it's not as if they've kind of relegated him all the way to the third team where he's got to compete against like Davion Davis and so on. But it's, you know, he doesn't really have much of a chance. I think what to watch for is first, obviously, just when those guys get out on the field for the first rep of 11s, who it is. That'll give you more information than who takes more snaps of the 1s. But you want to pay attention to whether or not Jordan Taylor can stay healthy, whether or not Brandon Zylstra is healthy again. One thing to keep in mind is that Jeff Badette has been unhealthy all offseason. Apparently, he could run the 40 yards of gold, so he must not be that not healthy. But the Vikings have been keeping him back, not him. He's wanted to practice.
Can he run it and get paid for it?
Evidently not. I guess that counts as off-season news. Let's talk about that in a second. But, yeah, but that's healthy enough to run a 40-yard dash. Technically, the team can't disallow him under, I think, the terms of their thing. But they can say, if you get injured, we're not paying for any of it. So, yeah, I think that he's kind of somebody, if he's healthy during camp, he could just surprise people and turn out to be the third wide receiver. So that's something to pay attention to, is I think the health of those 2 receivers, Jordan Taylor and Jeff Badette.
All right, the next thing we want to talk about is the 3 technique, because that is also something that's, I say, a little bit questionable going into camp.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that it's maybe the most open battle in camp. I think that when you compare it to the other battles, like wide receiver 3, there's kind of a more limited scope in those other battles of who can win the job. But I think that it's legitimately possible for basically anybody except for Tito Odenigbo to win the starting 3 technique spot. I think Curtis Cawthorn could win it, Jaleel Johnson could win it, Shamar Stephen could win it, Hercules Mataafa is the guy everyone's talking about. He could win it. Jalen Holmes could win it. I'm not saying they all have an equal shot at winning it. I think of those guys, Curtis Cawthorn is the least likely to win it. But I do think it's notable that it's not inconceivable that any of those guys could win the starting job there. And I mentioned Jaleel Johnson, even though we tend to view him as a nose tackle because Linval Joseph hasn't been participating in team drills, so we haven't actually seen what happens when Linval Joseph plays nose. Will Jaleel Johnson play 3 technique? He's a huge guy. He's over 320 pounds, but he played 3 technique at Iowa, and Zimmer says he's more of a natural 3 technique. Shamar Stephen is a backup nose tackle that just happens to be the size of a 3 technique. You know, what happens, when Linval Joseph comes back? He's been taking Stephen's been taking the 3 technique snaps with the first team, but I think the Vikings kind of view him as kind of a high floor, not necessarily the ceiling that they want to go after. I think that to them, Shamar Stephen represents a baseline level of talent that they can expect from the position, and that gives them a sense of reliability at the position, but I think they want somebody to beat him out. So after that, you get into, obviously, Hercules Mataafa is the most interesting one. He was 254 pounds coming out of college. I think he weighed 252 at the combine because teams wanted him to play linebacker. And then, the Vikings signed him to play linebacker. He gets injured, goes on IR. While he's on IR, adds good weight to get up to 275 pounds. The Vikings have him play defensive tackle. So he's kind of intriguing. He was monstrously productive at Washington State. And he's kind of like the coolest story, right? So that's probably the one that we're paying a lot of attention to. Mike Zimmer kind of initiated the conversation about him by bringing him up kind of unprompted on KFan, and then after that, I think everything else has just been media created. We've been asking questions about him, and so of course he continues to receive praise from the coordinators who are asked questions about him.
And let's be clear that this isn't something that is necessarily done all that often, which is put a rookie who ends up with an injury on IR for the year.
Yeah, I mean, they could have. By putting him on IR, they have to pay him most of the contract. They could have settled with an injury settlement and waived him outright. So that means that the team is probably pretty invested in him. They've done this a little bit in the past. They did it with Greg Childs, where they just kept on rostering him and putting him on IR just because they thought his level of talent was so high. That didn't end up working out, but I think it's a good indication that it's somebody that they put a lot of value in. So he's a guy that's kind of interesting. I think Jalen Holmes, who took the majority of the second team reps throughout the offseason, until I think the end of OTAs when we saw Mataafa taking more second team reps and the occasional first team rep. Jalen Holmes is kind of interesting. He's kind of he's similar to Mataafa in that he's quote unquote underweight for a defensive tackle. He's under 290 pounds. I think he told me he was 285. I want to say 283. But the difference is that he's like 6'5", Mataafa is 6'1", and Holmes has these enormously long arms. And Zimmer kind of likes that. He thinks that gives you an advantage in the leverage battle. And so the disadvantage of being tall, which is pretty significant at the defensive tackle position, Zimmer thinks is offset if you've got pretty long arms. So that's a guy that might be worth paying attention to because he was an edge rusher a little bit in college. And then, after that, I wouldn't say Armin Watts is completely out of the race either. He was enormously productive at Arkansas. The Vikings obviously wanted to invest a 6th-round pick in him. And he hasn't been getting as much rotation. He took some second team reps near the end, but mostly he's been kind of on the third team. So, he's kind of an interesting guy. He could move up as the pads go on and maybe he starts winning camp battles and stuff. But yeah, I think the 3 technique battle is the one that kind of holds the most in terms of wild cards.
Well, another thing we could talk about too is, let's just skip ahead to running back 2 real quick, because this is something that Latavius Murray had locked down for 2 years, and now that he's gone, there is a bit of a hole there. Yeah,
the Vikings drafted a 3rd-round pick, and normally you'd say after 3rd-round pick, just like Jerick McKinnon, he's running back 2, no question. But Alexander Mattison plays a very particular role, I think, and that's kind of as a goal line or 3rd and short back. And maybe he could be more. Obviously, he did much more at Boise State, and so maybe he could be the primary back. If Dalvin Cook goes down again, but I feel like the Vikings envision a particular role for him, and so they don't necessarily see him as an automatic running back too. What I think is most intriguing is that on the first team, when Dalvin Cook isn't on the field, and he wasn't actually on the field all that often with the first team, not in a way that's like alarming or anything like that. They just kind of rotated a little bit more heavily at running back than you would have expected based on their history. But it wasn't Alexander Mattison that took those reps. It was Amir Abdullah. And so I think is like, that's fascinating, right? Because I think a lot of us kind of wrote him off as the only way he makes the roster is if he's the kick returner, which, by the way, that seems like very likely that he's the kick returner. But the Vikings do seem to be putting him out on the field a lot, mostly as a pass catcher. And, he did everything in college. He wasn't just a scat back or anything like that. He was a bell cow at Nebraska. But, he's a guy that, he could conceivably win the running back 2 job. And they only have Mattison, at least for this first year, be a goal line guy or short yardage guy. But that's kind of intriguing. The Vikings are pretty high on Mike Boone. So, he's a guy that could pop. If he learns to run between the tackles about as well as he's been able to get open in space, he's a guy that could provide kind of an explosive counterbalance. And it could be a situation where the Vikings have kind of one guy that's all purpose. That would be Dalvin Cook. And then a bunch of guys for specific situations. Like you could have, Amir Abdullah out there if you want kind of a receiving back, and you could have Mike Boone out there if you want a guy that you slide out into the slot a lot. Kind of like Danny Woodhead and Darren Sproles are not typical, say, receiving backs, or Tariq Cohen are not typical receiving backs. They're more slot backs. Maybe Mike Boone kind of plays that role, and Amir Abdullah kind of straddles the difference between the two. And then, with Mattison as a goal line back, now you've got a bunch of different potential options. So, or, you could just have a guy kind of win the job outright. And I think that given the snaps that we've seen in OTAs, Abdullah's kind of got a better shot than we initially thought. I'm not going to say he's the favorite at running back 2, but I'm going to say it's probably notable that he's taken more running back 1 snaps than any of the other non-Dalvin Cook running backs out there. So that's somebody to watch. And then obviously you've got, other running backs that could move up the charts. If Rock Thomas hasn't, put himself in the doghouse, for example, that's a guy that, you could see winning the job again because he impressed pretty late in the preseason last year.
And I suppose it wouldn't be a Vikings offseason if we weren't talking about the offensive line.
Yeah, I think that we kind of expected this to be more of a quote-unquote battle than it was. The Vikings were kind of coy about whether or not Bradbury would be center or guard. There was a possibility that Pat Elflein wouldn't be a starting guard and that it would be kind of someone behind him. The Vikings drafted a guy in the 4th round, Drew Samia, that people are pretty high on. Aviante Collins has come back from injury, and the Vikings were pretty high on him. So there's maybe a lot of potential opportunity. And, Josh Klein, the guy they signed in free agency to start, and, they also signed Dakota Dozier, but, they paid Josh Klein a bit more money. The guy they signed in free agency to start, he didn't have a good year last year. And, he's not as athletic as, Brian O'Neill or Garrett Bradbury, Pat Elflein. And so he's not necessarily as clear cut an outside zone running fit as some other guys are. So, there's a possibility that he could have been outcompeted, but from what we've seen so far, there really hasn't been much competition, at least in terms of rotation along the first team on the offensive line. If the Vikings are really considering a competition, it could be genuine that they are, but they haven't demonstrated that to us in front of reporters by switching up the offensive line at all. The only changes to the offensive line have been when Brian O'Neill's been a little bit hurt and, Rashad Hill has played. So for the most part, we haven't seen any movement there. But I think that as camp goes on, it's kind of worth paying attention to, especially after the pads come on, like day 3 or 4. What happens when you've got Josh Klein, Pat Elflein, Drew Samia, Aviante Collins, all of them lining up against, these guys that are competing at the 3 technique spot. So I would expect kind of a lot of movement there. But more at 3 technique, obviously. But I think it's something to pay attention to. I would say for now, the offensive line we've gotten, I'd say 85-90% chance it's the offensive line we're going to see in week 1. So I don't want to oversell it, but I do want to say there's an opportunity that it's not locked in stone. And I think that both guard spots could be open to a reasonable amount of competition.
All right, and I suppose finally we can talk about the cornerback. Let's just say the cornerback 3 for that, and that's not necessarily the Trey Waynes spot, but this is kind of a weird. This is kind of like the black hole of our. Of our defense.
It's very bizarre, right? Because there was a lot of discussion in the offseason about trading Trey Waynes, and I don't want to put it completely in the passive voice. I actively participated in this discussion about trading Trey Waynes. I moved the discussion forward. I contributed to it. I don't want to say a lot of people were talking about it. But there's a lot of discussion, not just from me, but from a lot of people that this was going to happen, and from people who were connected, right? That this was a possibility. And from the Vikings' perspective, it makes a lot of sense. They've got a ton of depth. Now, that depth has questions, and we'll talk about it in the mailbag a little bit because some people asked about that. That depth has some question marks, but it's there. There's a ton of depth. And so with Trey Waynes in the final year of his contract, and Mackenzie Alexander too, the Vikings probably won't be able to re-sign him, so it might be better to try and see what you can get for him. And if you can trade him for more than what his compensatory pick value will be, which I don't necessarily think will be a third-round pick, could be, but I kind of doubt it. But you might be able to trade him for a second. So you could either get a second this year or a fourth next year, or 2 years from now, which, that's a huge difference, a second this year versus fourth from 2 years from now. With that in mind, the Vikings probably just would have liked to trade him. But without that happening, I think that kind of locks in Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes on the outside, CB1, CB2. And so then the question is kind of what happens at the nickel spot. I think at the beginning of last year, after the Hughes injury, and after, Terrence Newman retired and all that, at the beginning of last year, we would have said, well, when Hughes comes back, he's just going to take that nickel job. And then he's going to take over Trey Waynes' job the year after that. Great. But Mackenzie Alexander had a really phenomenal, and quietly, a really phenomenal year in the slot. He was, I think, one of PFF's best graded slot cornerbacks. Not, Pro Bowl worthy or anything like that, but a really, really good year. And so, and I feel like I just have to keep on bringing this up because I think a lot of people remember the Mackenzie Alexander that made a bunch of mistakes the year prior, which is not an affordance, or which is an affordance they gave Trey Waynes, I should say, that they were willing to overlook Waynes' mistakes the first couple of years he was there and kind of acknowledge now, hey, he's pretty good. Whereas with Alexander, I think people are kind of more stuck. And a lot of it has to do with snap count. Waynes is there every snap, and Alexander as a nickel guy is not. Plus, he was rotated with Terrence Newman and at the beginning of the year, Mike Hughes. So that's part of it too. But it is interesting that Alexander improves really significantly, and there's not as much discussion about it as there was with Waynes. And the first round, second round pick thing plays a role too. But that ends up becoming, I think, a really interesting discussion in light of the fact that Holton Hill looked pretty good when he was playing last year, but he's got a PED suspension, and Mike Hughes is coming back from injury, and so. Who ends up taking more snaps? Is it Holton Hill or Mackenzie Alexander? Hill hasn't, or Mike Hughes. Hughes hasn't played yet because he's still kind of on the recovery path, and the Vikings are being pretty careful. And so we haven't seen him in the rotation and to try and kind of determine where he'll be. So the default right now is Mackenzie Alexander. But I think that by the time the year starts, we're going to be in a different place in this discussion. So that's, I think, kind of intriguing to watch, kind of what happens there.
So we touched on it briefly, but can we talk about the 40-yard dash or the 40 yards of gold thing? Because as things come out about it, it just seems funnier and funnier to me.
Oh, yeah, it's brutal. So it starts because Ted Ginn just challenges Twitter, I think, to race him, and whoever wins in a head-to-head wins $10,000, right? And well, I get if they beat him, they are not obligated to pay Ted Ginn $10,000 if Ginn wins. But if you beat him, you get $10,000, right?
That's some Ocho Cinco sort of stuff right there.
Right? Yeah. Which it's been a while, so glad to see it.
Yeah.
I think the Ocho Cinco type personality we haven't seen. It's not like OBJ has a completely different approach. It's not the same as Ocho Cinco. Soon Ted Ginn's going to try playing for like the Kansas City Wiz or whatever the name of the Kansas City MLS team is now.
Exactly, and then go to the mall on the Saturday before the game and like tweet out, anybody want some shoes? I'm buying shoes.
Right, exactly.
The early days of NFL Twitter. Y'all want some shoes? I'm buying some shoes.
Man, I wish T. Ocho took off. What a show concept. So Ted Ginn challenges some people, everybody, to beat him in a 40-yard dash. The funniest was when Matthew Bowling, the guy who set the national high school record in the 100-meter dash, or set it and then didn't set it because it was like wind adjusted, and then I think set it again at the Texas State finals. If not, he got the Texas record. That's pretty impressive, I think. He responded with, "Yeah, you're on." I don't think he can though because of NCAA rules, which phenomenal. That happens, and then a couple of, I guess, University of Michigan grads were like, "No, this is a good idea. We should just do this. Invite, what was it, 16 NFL players? 32? I don't know. Feels like 16. Players and have them compete against each other for $1 million. Or rather, the grand prize is $1 million, and then the other prizes all add up to another $1 million. So $2 million worth of prize money on the table. So they invite...
If nothing else, it began as 16. I'm actually looking for the rest, but I think it's 16.
Yeah, I think it's 16. Also, results are like weirdly difficult to come by, despite the fact that like technically anybody could have just watched it all. They just had to pay $40, and then somebody could just post the results. But I haven't seen, I was looking for it like 2 days after it occurred, and I like couldn't find it, which kind of shocked me. I know who won. And I think I know who they raced against to win. It was Marquise Goodwin won, but, I have no idea kind of what the individual results are. So they invite 16 NFL players that I guess are known for their speed, plus Buda Baker. And so Ted Ginn is obviously one of them. DRC is one of. Is he still playing? Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie? Like
I'm
that can't be
certain
right.
That can't be right at all. Literally checking this right now.
That's wild to me.
The current team was the Redskins.
Yeah, Wikipedia says it's Washington. That fits, actually. That makes sense to me.
Washington becomes the old folks' home. I mean, that used to be the Raiders, but they're...
Well, somebody needed to replace D'Angelo Hall, I guess.
Just going to let that one...
By the way, DRC was on the Raiders last year, so...
I feel like I knew that, and that's where that came from.
But yeah, so DRC, Ted Ginn, I think those are the two oldest because they're like 32 and 33, which is like, why? They're invited. John Franklin, who I want to say is the guy that was on Last Chance U as a quarterback, and I think is a cornerback now. He tried to play quarterback for Auburn. I'm not going to look any of that up. I'm just going to assume all of that's the case. He's invited. Former Viking Terrell Sinkfield is invited. Current Viking Jeff Badette is invited. Guys who were purported to run like sub 4.2 at the pro days and people who actually ran 4.2 at the combine, and Buda Baker. Why was he invited? He's not slow by any stretch of the imagination, but if I could pick any safety,
chip on his shoulder? I don't know.
I don't like that. It's just maybe he knows someone. It's just like he ran a 4.45. He's not slow. He's really fast for a safety, but You know,
Maybe he just likes running.
Would have invited like TJ Green, a bad safety that ran like a 4.3 or something. I don't know. That's weird. Anyway, yeah. So a bunch of them are invited, and then like Ted Ginn drops out, and I think like 2 others drop out. Somebody ran one race, won it, then dropped out. Very bizarre. I predicted beforehand that it was going to be Marquise Goodwin beating Terrell Sinkfield in the finals because he had offense on one side, defense on the other side of the bracket. And I'm proud to say that I correctly predicted that the Olympic long jumper and nationally competitive college sprinter won. Go me for figuring that out. He won. I think he beat John Franklin. I don't remember. But I think the bizarre thing is, A, I couldn't find out how Jeff Badet or Terrell Sinkfield did. That's weird. But B, like, did they win 2 races, 1 race, no races? But B, nobody's been paid as of this recording. Like, they've received their checks. And they were told not to cash their checks until the Friday after the tournament, which has already happened, by the way. But Pro Football Talk, like, recently tweeted out that they still haven't been paid. So, cool. Great. It was a $40 pay-per-view event, and tickets to the event in the stadium.
How did you not buy that? How did you not buy that and write it off on your taxes? What were you doing that was so important?
I don't even know how I would have watched it.
I am disappointed.
If I can, like, my choices were to watch the fireworks show in Magic Kingdom or watch the 40-yard dashes.
Your phone is a very useful tool.
Magic Kingdom was free. I didn't pay for that.
All I'm saying is that the Lord gave you a smartphone, and
I took amazing pictures with it. So
yeah, and you could also use it to be streaming this terrible. What are people paying you for at the Athletic anyway?
Anyway,
let's deflect for a moment.
What a disaster that was.
Yeah,
tickets to the stadium were also like weirdly expensive. Like the most expensive ticket was like $600, which is a hilarious price to charge. But the least expensive ticket was like $20, and it's like if I'm going to a sporting event for $20, there's not a ton. But like baseball games, second tier seats for the Timberwolves, you know, a WNBA game, like those are all way better. Way better. You can get, depending on the baseball game, you can get like a third, and I hate watching it on TV, but I love watching it in person. You can sit along the baseline really close up front if you buy like day of for a game that's not that competitive. Which I don't care how competitive the game is. I'm out there to be at a baseball game, not to watch baseball.
Well, yes, and I remember the days when it was more expensive to park to go to the Target Center for a Timberwolves game than it was to get the actual tickets for the Timberwolves game. It was a wonderful time in my life. Yay college and yay specials that they were trying to get any person in there in 2007, 2008. Well,
can you imagine getting nosebleed seats for the 40 yards of gold?
Oh my God. So I'm surprised Darren Rovell didn't go and was like tweet all about the food that he was, trying not to eat while he was there. Like that seems like the sort of thing he would have attended.
He would have given us the stadium food breakdown.
Exactly. They serve the Luther burgers here, which is the Krispy Kreme donut and then the cheeseburger inside, and then you got all the bacon and what the hell, a couple of corn dogs in here too. But this is what you can get at this particular event for one night only because I'm paid to do this. Let's go to the mailbag, and Raul starts with a great question. What's the better take? The hit rate on day 3 of the draft is so low. So do you A, gather lots of picks on day 3, or B, get rid of your day 3 picks?
Well, so like the obvious caveat to this is like, what does it cost / what are you getting to do those things, right? Like If you get rid of all your day 3 picks and you get one late day 2 pick, probably not worth it. If you get rid of all your day 3 picks and get a day 1 pick, definitely worth it, right? And then like kind of vice versa. Like if you sacrifice all your day 2 picks and only get 7th round picks, probably not worth it, right? But assuming typical NFL trade values, which are trending closer and closer to the Chase Stewart trade chart and further away from the traditional Jimmy Johnson trade chart, they still haven't kind of equalized. The math basically says to grab the day 3 picks. That I think there's a problem with that. It's not universal, right? Because you only have so many roster spots and distributing talent and so many starting spots, distributing talent among like 10 picks in day 3 versus concentrating talent among 3 picks in day 2. It doesn't help you to have a bunch of really great cornerback 4s until you need them, right? But it helps you a lot to have a pretty good cornerback 2. And so the collective value, the approximate value, or however you want to measure it, using whatever measure you can, of the cornerback 4s is greater than the collective value that's used in these calculations typically than the pretty good cornerback 2. But it helps your team more to have the cornerback 2 because you're going to cut some really good players at the bottom of your roster otherwise, and they're not going to help you. So I think generally speaking, you trend towards more day 3 picks, but there's a limit. And at some point, you have to acknowledge the fact that only 11 of your guys can be on the field at a time. And so you need to pick with that in mind and know that, getting a bunch of good backups is very valuable. But getting a bunch of good backups that you'll cut is pointless. And so you have to, at some point, get a guy who's going to start. So it kind of depends on the realities of your roster. That's kind of the answer that you get to a lot of like analytics questions is like, oh, it depends. So I do want to caveat it out and say NFL teams still overvalue day 2 picks overall. But that doesn't mean universally they should trade away those day 2 picks for day 3 picks. It just means they should, on the whole, do it more often. So, yeah, I mean, day 3 picks tend not to mean anything. But having that many, having a bunch of picks will get you kind of the lottery ticket you need to get your next Stephon Diggs or something. So, yeah, I would generally trend towards more day 3 picks, but like don't overdo it.
I don't think Spielman would be okay with the process because it doesn't involve the haul of picks that he tends to be happy with. I feel like if we got rid of day 3 picks, he would just be in a bad mood for the rest of the season. Oh
yeah, just be mopey and grouchy all the time.
It would resemble hangry, but he was hangry for picks. Bill Botke asks a long question, but pretty good. Says when the Broncos decided not to hire Kubiak this year, they gave 2 reasons to Ian Rappaport of the NFL Network. The first was that they did not want to hire certain Kubiak assistant coaches. The second was that the Broncos wanted to bring in a quote new age, innovative offensive coordinator to kind of get the Broncos in the right direction. I want to ask for a second question. From what Arif has seen at the Vikings practice so far, is there reason to think the Vikings offense will be uncreative, or does he think that it will be inventive and cutting edge? Also, does an offense need to be creative to get results, or is it enough to place excellent players into a versatile scheme and that lets them to make plays?
I think that some degree of creativity is necessary. Unless you've got such high-level execution like the uncreative Peyton Manning offenses, and it's tough, right? Because on the one hand, you can say, hey, the Sean McVay LA Rams offense is really creative because it does a lot of things that we don't typically see in the NFL. But on the other hand, you could say it's not very creative at all because the things it does do, which again, we don't see very often in the NFL, it does them a lot. Like it doesn't change all the they run the same personnel more than any other team in the league. They run 11 personnel more than any other team in the league. They don't pass to tight ends as a result all that often. They run wide zone more than any other run that they've got in their playbook. They run boot action a ton for play action. They run very similar passing concepts a lot, and they do a bunch of jet motion, which tends to look the same after a while. Their formations aren't all that unique either, and so there's kind of like a, what are you asking when you ask, is creativity necessary? And it's very difficult to kind of pin down what creativity means in certain contexts. I would argue that the Bill Musgrave offenses with the Vikings were extraordinarily creative, and I think generally in good ways. Obviously, you're restricted by the fact that you've got Christian Ponder. I think something that we didn't appreciate as much when we were talking about Bill Musgrave back at the time. But you take a look at what they were able to do with like Percy Harvin, for example, and you have to kind of respect a lot of the things that they did, at least within the individual plays that they called. But, obviously that creativity didn't result in a ton of points until kind of Adrian Peterson just took over and stuff, and like how much of that is Musgrave. So, it's difficult to kind of pin down what is creative, because Musgrave did tons of different things. And you've got Percy as a running back. You've got Adrian Peterson as a fullback. You've got Adrian Peterson kind of split into the slot on occasion. You've got, Percy running routes that didn't exist in the route tree, which I think some of that might have actually just been Percy and not Musgrave. You've got different ways to try and protect Christian Ponder and account for Christian Ponder. You've got, different ways to use the other receivers on your roster. You've got, guys like Kleinsasser playing, tight end and fullback and wing back and H-back kind of before we saw a lot of tight ends do that. So there's a lot of creativity in that offense. And I don't know kind of what that necessarily amounted to. So, what does it mean to be creative? Chip Kelly was creative until he wasn't. I would say that there's got to be some degree of newness that you provide, either in terms of what you put out on the field from snap to snap, that there's got to be some variation, or in terms of what the league sees from week to week, that if you're different from what the league tends to see, that's a good thing. But it's probably got to be one or the other. And that's probably necessary unless the level of execution in your offense is so incredibly high that you don't need to do those things. So, Brady Gronk type connection. In terms of what this means for the Vikings, I'm not that concerned, because I tend to think, and I know there are people kind of in other areas the Vikings beat that would characterize it differently, but I tend to think that Stefanski has more control than Kubiak, and Kubiak is genuinely providing the consultation role that he was asked to provide and that they've publicly said he's had. And I'm not saying that because I implicitly trust the organization or whatever. We still don't know what happened with Norv Turner, and there's always kind of weird stuff behind the scenes, and it feels like they're not necessarily always being honest with us, and it's not like they necessarily are required to be honest with us or whatever, but it does open them up to kind of questioning their motives in a lot of cases. I don't think this is one of them. I think that someone like Stefanski is somebody that they've wanted to put in an offensive coordinator position for a while, and they're not just going to cut it out from under him the day he gets it after they blocked him from going somewhere by removing all of his ability to contribute to play design and stuff like that. So I'm not that concerned about it. And I don't think that Kubiak offenses, they've obviously been around for a very long time, but I don't think they're uncreative in the sense that you tend to see them a lot around the league. I don't think that they get replicated in the same way, because I think that the reliance on rollouts and boots and the way that they use running backs in those offenses, you don't tend to see all the time in other offenses. Now, because it's a West Coast offense and it comes from the same DNA as all the Shanahan stuff, it's going to look very similar to the McVay stuff and the Kyle Shanahan stuff and the stuff that's kind of taking over the league right now. But it's still in the vein of most offenses are not doing that. So I'm not that concerned about it. And I would say that what we've seen in camp is not going to tell us how creative the offense is because they are intentionally not being creative in front of media. A lot more two tight end stuff, which to some people can sound like, oh, that's very creative because when you've got two tight ends, you can run or you can pass, you can change a formation, you can do whatever you want. You've got an H-back and Irv Smith, he can go out wide, line up in fullback, whatever. You can really confuse the defense. It's, really flexible and it allows you to call a lot of plays. And other people will be like, oh, that's really old school. It kind of relies on you to do the run a little bit more. It kind of over relies on pass catchers that don't win as much downfield, so it's not as explosive. So even when you say, hey, they're going to run more two tight end this year than they did last year, some people will interpret that as creative and other people won't. And they'll say that that's too old school. And I think, the concerns from that are probably legitimate. And we haven't seen, people have wanted two tight end offenses to take over the league. And outside of like Philadelphia, we haven't seen a ton of that after the Patriots successfully, did that with Gronk and Hernandez. And a bunch of people wanted, maybe not that dynamic exactly, but they wanted to have versatile two tight end sets, and like they just couldn't do it because they're pretty singularly talented players on that offense. So, yeah, I mean, in some senses it's creative in that it's doing something a little bit different than the rest of the league, and in other senses it's not creative because it's kind of old school. But then again, nobody's doing anything that football hasn't seen before. So
yeah. Next question is from Kai, who asks, did the team get better or worse on defense?
I mean, probably worse, right? They lost a player.
They lost an impact player.
Yeah, so I guess probably worse, but that doesn't mean definitely the defense will do worse, right? Because Harrison Smith could play better, this year than he did last year. Because last year, he played phenomenally well, and it was a down year for him. So maybe he could play better, right? Xavier Rhodes, I would expect him to play better than he did last year, right? So you could have the individual players potentially play better. I would expect Anthony Barr to play better. And I thought he played really well last year outside of the LA game and certain elements of that Buffalo game. I thought he played really well. In the LA game, mostly not his fault.
And of course, Everson Griffin didn't exactly set the world on fire last year.
Right. So I think from a personnel perspective, yeah, of course they got worse. The defense didn't add anybody until day 3, right? Until a 5th round pick for a linebacker that's not going to start. So okay. And they didn't really get anybody in free agency except I guess Anthony Barr, but that's not a get, that's a keep. So yeah, I mean the defense got worse on paper, but that doesn't mean the defense will be worse. Just wrote a piece in The Athletic about this, about how to predict how the defense will do. And I say it's more likely than not they'll be a top 5 defense this year. So and I laid out kind of me and Chad. It's a back and forth between me and Chad Graff. We went back and forth on kind of what are the pitfalls and concerns that could move them out of the top 5. What are the things that make you confident that they'll be in the top 5 again? That sort of thing. So I mean, yeah, the defense quote unquote got worse, but that doesn't mean it's gotten worse, right? I know that sentence sounds weird, but I think you get what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Next question is from Matthew, who says, Arif and James, what do you reckon is the likelihood of the Vikings picking up some last-minute free agent cornerbacks as Hill has his suspension and the Hughes injury is still up in the air?
I don't think very likely. I mean, the suspension is only for 4 games, and obviously that's a quarter of the season, right? It's not extraordinarily small, but I don't think that if the suspension was 4 random games, I'd be much more concerned. The NFL picks games out of a hat, right? And it's yeah, you're out week 13, week 16, week 2, and week 5, right? Those are the games. And I would be way more concerned. But you need those guys more later in the year as wear and tear and injuries pile up. So, 4 games at the beginning of the year, it's not ideal, but it's not awful, right? Unless obviously somebody else gets injured, but it's always bad when somebody gets injured, so there's no reason to caveat that out. And then Hughes, I just think they're taking it slow. I think he's ready to play. But they just want to be careful because they have so much depth. There's no reason to be aggressive about it. So I'm not that concerned, but I will admit that it does kind of put questions on what the Vikings have for depth early in the season, right? Because Hughes will continue to get healthier. until he starts playing football and people hit him and he, gets hurt because that's what happens when you play football. And having Holton Hill come back. So obviously later on in the season, you're going to have kind of quote unquote more depth to deal with kind of whatever inevitable problems rise up. But, early in the season, maybe depth is a bit of a concern, but I'm not that concerned. Chris Boyd, I don't think is ready. So I'm not going to say that Chris Boyd is going to resolve those concerns, but it is nice to have him. So, I think that those things are worth noting when talking about the cornerback depth, but I don't think that they're things that make me seriously concerned about the depth unless you have, something like just really awful happen in the first 4 weeks of the season.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. Corey Rug asks, how are defenses reacting and developing to play action threats? Do we expect the Vikings to change anything specifically in personnel or training to address it this year?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the Vikings have been pretty bad at play action on defense relative to their overall defense. So they're better than most teams against play action. But the gap between what they do on standard passing plays versus play action passing plays is fairly large and has been. One of the issues has really just been the ability of Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks to track tight ends. And you saw that week 1 last year against San Francisco. And I think George Kittle ended up dropping it or it was inaccurate or something. But there was a deep pass to George Kittle that was wide open. And I want to say it was Eric Kendricks in coverage that time, but I'm not completely confident. And it wouldn't make sense if it was Anthony Barr because later a lot of the same concepts were used by the LA Rams to attack Anthony Barr. So there have been some concerns about the way play action baits the linebackers to move away from tight ends. I would say that, A, the prevalence of play action in the offense that the Vikings have right now will help kind of train the defense. But B, I would say that this is a concern that they know that they have. I've brought it up a couple of times in pressers, and Zimmer's been kind of frank about it. So they know that they have this concern, and they're going to work to correct it. I know that people have asked, people have asked the players, not asked me, but people in the media have off the record asked players or asked coaches well, what if you just cared about the run less? What if you didn't always take that first step when you read a run? And it's very well, then they'll be able to run the ball. And you're well, yeah, but you'd rather they do that than pass the ball, right? Because they only get 5 yards if you're bad at it as opposed to 30. And it's well, yeah, but they'd be able to run all over you. You're okay, well, that's the attitude. So there's always going to be a problem against play action because it's embedded.
It's just well, when they don't have Trey Waynes up to stop the run, at that point it'll be a little bit difficult to. When we don't have Linval Joseph up there, it'll be a little more difficult to stop the run as well. It's well, yeah, but we're still going to just throw as many people right down the middle just to always stop the run first.
Right.
That's kind of the culture. At this point, I feel like it's culture. Corey also asks, what is the best barbecue you've ever had?
Probably Oklahoma Joe's in Kansas City. Yeah, I want to say it was the burnt ends at Oklahoma Joe's. Amazing. And that's almost a cop-out answer because Oklahoma Joe's is very famous and all that, and so it's everybody knows to go to Oklahoma Joe's and it's the big popular place and whatever. But it's amazing. I've been to a bunch of barbecue places. I've been to a bunch of holes in the wall. I've been all over Mobile now to a bunch of different barbecue places there. And there's some good ones and there's some not as great ones. They've all been better than average food, so I don't want to say not good ones, but the burnt ends at Oklahoma, I still dream about them.
So mine actually feels more like a cop-out than yours.
Famous Dave's.
It is not Famous Dave's. I have a soft spot in my heart for Famous Dave's corn for the cornbread, okay? I told my fiance that the way to my heart was through cornbread, and she didn't believe me, and then she started making it. I was okay, well, now we're good. No, the place that I enjoyed the most is actually in Vegas, of all places. It was this weird country bar that was inside of TI, inside of Treasure Island. I believe it's still there, although I could be mistaken.
As the locals call it, TI.
Yes, as the locals call it, TI. I learned during my week there for the conference I was at, everyone just calls it TI. I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to call it that then. But yeah, so there's this country bar in TI, and it's right over by where they have all of the like Pirates of the whatever outside. But it's the country bar, and if you go there early enough, no one's there to mess with you, and you can just order a big slab of ribs. And that was the best rib I've ever had. It was insane.
Well, that's like kind of the thing about barbecue, right? Is that like the best barbecue you'll ever have, might just be a place. It's supposed to kind of like surprise you when it's really good. Like
wow, that might be the best thing I've ever eaten.
Right. Like I've been to relatively well-known places in Texas, and I've been like, nah, this is all right or whatever. And, I just pull off into a random gas station, right? And it's some of the best barbecue I've ever had. The place in Mobile is maybe up there in my top 5 barbecue. It's not the place most of the people go to at the Senior Bowl. It's like the second most visited place, which is not to say it's like, wow, you're going to the place nobody knows about. It's packed every day, so it's not like. But they had this like brisket sandwich that just melted in my mouth in Minneapolis, or rather, I should say, in the Twin Cities. The place that by far to me has had the best barbecue in the Twin Cities is Firebox Deli. I think it's in St. Paul. I want to say it's phenomenal. Like, it's so good. And like Southern food, go to Revival. That's great. But barbecue, go to Firebox Deli. It's so good.
I don't think I am familiar with Firebox Deli.
That's what I'm saying.
It's technically in Minneapolis.
Oh, okay. It's on like the border or something.
Yeah, it's over on Lindale, so it's like it's you can basically see the the Mississippi from it because it's right next to like 94 and everything. So
yeah, I think it's right next to a Payday Loan in a strip mall or something like that. So it's good.
Well, yeah, that's there was this place in St. Paul over by University in Snelling where I lived for about a year, and all you heard were police sirens. It was a wonderful place. After a while, you just stopped hearing them. It's like, wow, how do you sleep here? You get used to it. There was a place over by all the bars and the bookstore, and I can't remember the place, but it was like you'd have people like line up around the block at Sunday morning or Saturday morning, and you'd be in line for like 2 hours. And I finally just pulled over one time. I was like, well, there's a bunch of people pulled over for this, or there's a bunch of people like in line for this. I have to see what this is about. And it was amazing. And I don't know if they still have it, but it was disturbing how good it was. Like, wow, this is fantastic. And this is in St. Paul. I'm confused about a few things happening in my life. Like, I loved living in St. Paul and all. I just had questions. That's all. Hunter asks, the Vikings win the Super Bowl, but Arif and therefore Norse Code now have to follow the Lions exclusively. Do you do it? This is basically like the Rick and Morty episode with the gifts that will give you what you want, but there's there's the one little catch.
So we talked about this a little bit pre-show, and then I was like, no, save it for the podcast. But my question initially was, do you have to cover the Lions the year that the Vikings win the Super Bowl, or do you cover the Vikings the year they win the Super Bowl, and then every year after you cover the Lions? And if the answer is the second one, which I think is what we agreed was what Don from Ohio was implying, I would say yes. But if the answer is the first one, that's so tough. I'm not allowed to talk about the team that's on this like magical destiny run. Like, that sucks. Although the last time we had a magical destiny run team, I just kept shitting on it. So I'm sorry, Case Keenum.
There is that.
You're right.
That really was all your fault.
Yeah,
38-7 had everything to do with you.
Yeah, it is my fault. I'm sorry. Yeah, that would tear my heart out that I can't be like, let's talk about this team that's really good and stuff. Although it could also just be the case they're like a 9-7 team and then they just like Eli Manning their way into the Super Bowl or something. Like that's possible too.
I like the idea that that's a verb. Luke Braun asks, what's the best possible roster change the Vikings could make today?
I don't know. It's like they can't because the salary. Like I don't know what the parameters of this question are, right? Because it's like, well, no one's available. Otherwise, somebody would have signed them. I assume Jonathan Hankins is available because he always seems to be available for some reason. But otherwise, it's like just Richie Incognito, right? No, he just got signed, didn't he? Wow. That's dumb. By the Raiders, I think? That makes sense, actually. Never mind.
Yeah.
But there's not like people that are available as far as I know. They don't have a salary cap and a trade seems kind of untenable. So in order for this question to be answerable, I guess I'd have to be abstract about it. And the area that you'd most want the Vikings to be able to make like a reasonable move at would probably be guard. It's the lowest value position, I think, that you could say. Like, if Eric Eager is listening to this podcast, and I assume he's not, but if he is, I'm sure, like, he heard that answer and he just, like, kind of slapped his head. But, like, I assume Kirk Cousins is, like, untouchable, right? So you can't change that. The wide receivers are fine. Wide receiver 3 might matter more than guard, but, like, that'll shake itself out. You could add a 3 technique, but they're set on, like, corner, safety. I like the linebacker situation. You might be able to add an edge rusher, but the area of greatest weakness is guard. And so I'll kind of step away from my typical analytics focus and just be like, yeah, just don't get a ton of pressure up the middle. So yeah, just trade for a guard, I guess.
Like, I suppose first we have to like build the universe and then like start from there as far as like any sort of roster move. Like, okay, wow. Kenneth Allen, what game are you most looking forward to this next year?
Yeah, the Seahawks game.
Well, I think it obviously has to be the Seahawks game where we'll be doing a live show. But it is important that you'll be finally seeing your Seahawks in person.
No, it's because of the live show, James. That's why I'm excited.
Has nothing to do. Can we get Danny Kelly for this? Like, can we get, like, I know he's got a kid now, but I feel like...
Yeah, it's details.
we may have a venue, so we can...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we had somebody give us a heads up on a potential venue tip. So we might have a venue.
Yes, but
I am worried about the amount of Seahawks Twitter that might show up. So
it's your homecoming. Why would this be some form of a concern?
Jesus.
Also,
I'm just glad that like Mina Kimes lives in like New York, so I don't have to deal with that. That's a bad way to phrase that. But
you want another turn at that one? Because I'm not deleting it, but I'll let you rephrase it.
I love Mina. Just, there's a lot of Seahawks Twitter happening, I suspect, and she's a force multiplier for that. So I don't want that. She's great. Being in Seattle for that, not great. Aside from Seattle, I think the Kansas City game, and I think I might be in Kansas City for that, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah. Next question is also from Kenneth Allen. It says, which players are you most excited to see with the pads on in the preseason? Hercules has to be right up there.
Yeah, I think Hercules is probably up there. Garrett Bradbury, I think, just to see how he kind of transitions into the NFL. Because, if he can continue to be like really impressive and good, that'll be kind of fun. But yeah, Hercules is up there. I think I think the whole 3 technique rotation, I'm interested in how Hercules is going to do. I'm interested in Armin Watts. I'm interested in Jalen Holmes. I think all of those guys are kind of the guys that have the most to gain and therefore kind of the most interesting to follow. I'm not that excited about Alexander Madison putting on the pads. So cool. Which, I don't hate him or anything like that. I mean, yeah, the Vikings might have overspent, but, like, you know, he is who he is. And that role can be valuable because the most valuable runs are short yardage. So I'm not, like, but it's not, like, exciting to me. Like, more exciting to me is, like, Mike Hughes, if he ever puts on pads in the preseason. He's not playing a particularly physical position, but I like to see him get hit and lay some hits, and him to be able to act as if nothing's happened. That'll be exciting.
You know, I've got an answer that's not one that you've mentioned, but I kind of want to see Dalvin Cook come back in, and we saw a little bit of him like kind of like being let loose, and I really want to see what they're going to end up kind of doing with him. And so seeing his cuts again, or seeing like how he ends up finessing through, I'm kind of interested to see it because of this love or devotion to a fault to the run that they seem to be putting themselves towards. I kind of want to see what the hell they're going to do with him. And it felt like in the beginning of the year they had this really like short leash on him, and as the year went on they kind of let him go. But I kind of want to see what they're going to end up doing with him.
I'm still reminded of Dalvin had like this huge run for it's either a touchdown or like to the 1 yard line or something like that, and he mentioned something like, yeah, I'm still only around like 80%. And Mike Zimmer was like, that's him at 80%. Jeez. So kind of excited about a Dalvin that's let loose. But I suspect that he's not going to be going as hard as he could be until the regular season just starts. So.
Well, yeah. Jacob Kost. Do you believe that had the 1998 Vikings advanced to the Super Bowl to face Elway's Broncos that they would have won? What about the 87 and 09 teams? Let's just stick with 98 and 09 because 87 is just going to turn into a shouting match.
You kind of almost did in the Twitter mentions. I got to say, honestly, I don't know that much about the 87 team. I know that breaking down the statistics from that year obviously don't matter because of the shortened season and the like weirdness involving all the players. So I get that, but I mean that Washington team was pretty good, so beating them would have been pretty great to get against to play against the Broncos. But I don't know that you beat that Broncos team. But you know, I just don't know enough to say, hey, you know, you'll crush the early iteration of that Elway team. Let's talk about the later Elway team that they could have crushed.
Yeah.
I think they could have gone throw for throw with the Broncos and beaten them in 98.
I'm not entirely sure about 98. 98 would have been really that would have been one hell of a one.
Oh yeah, that would have been a fun game to watch. That's for sure.
Like the defense at that point wouldn't have mattered. Like,
right? Yeah. So like the fact that they've got Terrell Davis and Ed McCaffrey and Rod Smith and Shannon Sharp. Like, and then John Elway's thrown to them, and you think about it, and you're like, wow, that sounds unstoppable. And then you're like, wait a second. The 98 Vikings outscored them by, like, not a ton, but a significant amount that year. I mean, statistically, the 98 Vikings were one of the best teams of all time, right? And they were much better statistically than the 98 Broncos. It's not like the same thing because you've got to bring in kind of who's healthy, who's not, kind of what the matchups are and stuff like that. But I think just generally speaking, the 98 Vikings, you take a look at like DVOA, you take a look at opponent adjusted point differential, you take a look at just offensive, defensive stats, points per drive, offensive and defensively. The Vikings basically just outclassed them. It would be like a 42-38 game, right? But like, yeah, I think the Vikings were just a better team. Like, I think it's a product of history for us to take a look at John Elway and Shannon Sharp and even, you know, and Terrell Davis and then even Rod Smith and Ed McCaffrey and just be like, man, what an incredible team. But like, they didn't win as many games as the Vikings did that year. Like, it's like, I don't think it was as good of a team. It's just, I think the rosy glasses of history looking at the Broncos tell us that it's a better team than it was. And it was a great team. But I think it just tells us that it was a better team than it actually was. I think the 98 Vikings are better. So would they have beaten them? I think so. I think that it's much easier for me to talk about the 2009 thing. Our best episode ever was just a rewatch of that game, the NFC Championship game.
Agreed. And I feel like we may have covered this question during that fantastic episode that you should all listen to.
And there are people who are like, I didn't want to listen to this. It would have been traumatizing. And then they listen to it and they actually really enjoy it. So I'm not just being sarcastic when I'm just like, yeah, you should listen to us talk about this devastating game that we like saw coming because it's a rewatch.
It was so good. It was so much fun to listen to, or like listen back at and watch the game. Boy, that I don't think
they beat the Colts that year.
I think the defense holds up. I think the offense falls apart.
Well, yeah, I think Favre's dead, right? Like
it would have been the equivalent of the 38-7 game. Like
right, yeah.
you would have had this massive hangover from it. I'm not confident that Childress would have been able to like rein them in over 2 weeks to get them to be able to practice and like get Favre out of the iron lung long enough to be able to like stand upright.
Right. Yeah. Like I think if you take a look at and this is kind of one of the things that I wish I could speak more confidently with about the 98 thing, because I can talk about the immediate aftermath of the 09 game with much more detail, which is if you take a look at the 09 team and compare it to the 09 Colts team, I think the 09 Vikings are better. But I think the circumstances of that game would not have allowed the Vikings to win that game, just because the driver of the offense, and like it's not like Peterson was having a bad year, but he was not the driver of the offense, was broken, and asking him to play another game is like a war crime. Which, I mean, the Vikings did do that. They asked him to play 16 more games, but
well, they asked him to. He didn't, but they asked him to. An attempt was made to accomplish that contractually. It did not complete, but damn it, he tried.
But yeah,
we still need to honor him in the Vikings Ring of Honor during a Monday night football game against the Packers. Like, I just want to see that before I die. Can we do that like as a people? Just honor Brett Favre for the greatest season for the greatest offensive production for a quarterback in like Vikings history.
Like that would be a ton of fun, but I just feel like it's just going to fundamentally, I think, feel a little pathetic because there's no ring. Like that's just the problem. Like I love the pettiness of it, but it feels a little pathetic.
Does that, so let's assume that on this topic.
Sorry, I know you've got a good thought, but I've got a better one, I guarantee it.
Sit down, James.
We should induct the quote that Brett Favre says when he says, "This is the best team I've ever played with." There's some variation of it. We should induct that quote into the Ring of Honor.
Can they do that? I feel...
It's their state. They can do whatever they want.
Along the lines of the there was no ring, and so it would be like a hollow thing. If Stephon Diggs, there was some Vikings discussion on Twitter about the active players and who was most likely to end up in the Ring of Honor, and no one on the list said Stephon Diggs, which my thought was it should be Stephon Diggs because of the catch. Like, he should never have to pay for a drink in this town ever again. But because there's no ring associated with that moment, does it later become like faded into that awesome Randy Moss, like behind like lateral sort of thing where you're not putting in the guy who got the lateral on it?
So I think that if you get a ring later, I think because people have weird memories, they're not going to necessarily say, hey, he did that and that led to a ring, but they're going to take out the gut punch part of it. So, for example, speaking, I think it was 87, right, when Elway had the drive. I want to say it was 87. But I think that when you take a look at some of the kind of the most famous moments in history, in football history, they tend not to occur, unless it's literally during the Super Bowl, they tend not to occur to teams that win a Super Bowl that year. But we very often remember the ones for teams that end up winning a Super Bowl, if that makes sense. So I think that if Stephon Diggs ends up with a ring, the Minneapolis Miracle is like back in play in terms of like legendary moment. I mean, it still is in play as a legendary moment, but it doesn't have like that bittersweet sting to it because the process played out and you end up with a ring eventually. So Yeah, I mean, a lot of like the most famous moments for quarterbacks and I guess receivers and stuff that have not been in Super Bowls have, I think, become part of the lore of those players as they've won those Super Bowls.
I think the drive was 86. I want to say the drive was 86. Matt McKeon asks, pick 3 NFL teams other than the Vikings if you had to A, bet $50 on one team to win the Super Bowl, B, wear a team's quarterback jersey every game day for the whole 2019 season, and C, watch every one of a team's 2019 regular season games live.
So I assume I'm not getting like even odds, right, on the Super Bowl thing?
Right.
Because otherwise it's like I'm obviously picking the Patriots. But it's the odds that we get at, well, I just Googled it, so whatever Odds Shark is. Wow, definitely not the Bears or the Browns. Jesus. I mean, I like the Browns. Like, plus 1,200? Kidding me?
I think the Browns might be my jersey one.
Yeah, I think the Browns are my jersey one, too. That one's easy. I would say and this actually kind of goes to because his answer for the jersey was the Chargers because of Phillip Rivers. But I'm going to go with the Chargers for the odds to win it, which I'm always way too high on the Chargers. They always like kill me in the playoffs, but whatever. They're a good team. They've got a good quarterback. They've got a good defense.
Whatever helps you sleep at night. I've never. I watch the Chargers. I watch the Chargers to watch them fail. Like that is my reason behind it. I would almost consider.
So is that your answer to the number 3?
I almost should, because I whenever I'm watching, especially a primetime Phillip Rivers game, I'm just waiting for that second half of the fourth quarter. I'm just waiting for that.
But it's not. Well, it doesn't matter if it's his fault or not because it's still the Chargers. Mm-hmm. It was Derek Lawson who tweeted out that he lives in quarterback hell because he's perpetually down a score with 7 minutes left.
Yes.
And then someone checked statistically and he spent like 3 times as long in that situation as anyone else in NFL history. That
would answer a lot of questions I have about Phillip Rivers, quite frankly.
It's just like, why are you so angry? Oh, okay.
As far as betting $50 on one team to win the Super Bowl, I think I would end up, even though I would be throwing my money away, I would consider throwing it at either Kansas City or maybe the Colts. I think the Colts could be an interesting team.
Colts are way too overvalued.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
Well, I'm not a huge Andrew Luck guy, so maybe that's it.
I think I would do that. As far as a team's quarterback jersey every game day for the 2019 season.
I can't beat the Browns. The Browns one is so good.
Yeah, I think I got to go with the Browns. But the team that I would watch every game, I think I would end up picking the Texans. Just
really?
Because Watson,
I was gonna cop out and pick the Chiefs.
I think the Watson is just really, really entertaining to go.
Unlike the Chiefs, good point.
Yeah, well, that Chiefs team. I'm not saying that their whole draft guide came out of some violent offenders like playbook or something, but that team is falling apart in a few different ways.
Well, okay, so they got rid of Kareem Hunt, and I don't think running backs matter that much, and they kind of demonstrated that with Damian Williams. The Tyreek Hill thing is, like, bizarre.
Quite.
So, and like, obviously, like, he's like a piece of shit. But the most recent allegations, like, they're going, like, there's, like, another direction. Like, Benjamin Albright just tweeted out that Tyreek Hill might be a victim in this whole scenario and that everything is propped up by Crystal or something. I don't know. I don't want to say that that's something with definitiveness, especially because that's an accusation that women often have to deal with. But there's like evidence there is definite evidence that he didn't break his son's arm, that his son just broke his own arm. But the threatening audio might not be what we think it is, or so it's like very bizarre. But I mean, like, Patrick Mahomes is dope. I want to watch him.
I want to watch.
Maybe
Patrick
it's the
Mahomes
Browns.
too.
Do I get to not pick the Browns because I picked them for the jersey?
It has to be 3 separate teams, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So Well, I'm definitely not taking a Chiefs jersey, so it's got to be the Browns. The Giants would be funny, but I would get kind of like the Raiders, but I'd get sick of it.
Oh God, yeah, that would be way too much sugar. Like you'd just be sitting there by the end, just comatose, can't feel your feet. Like this needs to be done. Why
I think I watched the Chiefs because if they do collapse, that has its own entertainment value.
And the head coach of the Chiefs has this wonderful love of messing up with like 2 minutes to go in the quarter or the half or something. So I mean,
yeah, it's got its own Chargers-esque quality to it.
Chargers-esque. There we go. That's sad. Eddie the dog asks, beyond lurking on Twitter, what's the single thing you waste the most time doing? Wasting time being defined as something that significantly occupies your effort or attention, but you draw little to no fulfillment from.
YouTube.
Yeah. That
didn't take me very long at all, honestly.
No,
I am subscribed to, I think, over 60 YouTube creators. God, what an awful word, creators. YouTube channels. And I keep up with them. It's like, I mean, some of them I just really enjoy, obviously. Like Binging with Babish. I'm trying to like pick one of the non-political channels that I really enjoy to bring out there.
So you went with Babish. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of political channels that I enjoy, but also ones that I just watch because I hate myself.
If you ever really want to hate yourself and go down the cooking route, just do some searches for Matty Matheson. And
I love Matty Matheson so much.
He is. What is it? He is dollar store dude Ferraro. Like he. Right around the time that during his instructions on how to make, I believe it was a pasta sauce, included, now you're going to need about 3 key bumps worth of salt. We died. Like,
so good.
It was. I actually used one of his ideas on something a couple days ago, and I felt like a tool because like I'm listening to something Matty Matheson told me in between like screaming takes into the camera.
Was it the Cheeto mac and cheese or whatever it was?
It was not the Cheeto mac and cheese where he's eating it in a tub. No, that was not me. Let me be clear.
But for people who are not exposed to Matty Matheson, he makes genuinely like good food, and he's got genuinely good, like the Cheeto mac and cheese thing sounds awful, and it probably is, but most of the stuff, almost all of the stuff is like genuinely good cooking advice.
Except he's doing it in like a trap house for the beginning.
Right. He's just yelling at you the whole time. Very friendly, wholesome. Wholesome's the wrong word.
Wholesome is definitely the wrong word.
It's not wholesome. It's like
there's more swearing in those.
He's got a kind heart the whole time. I think that's completely accurate. There's tons of don't let children under the age of 22 watch it. But other than that, very kind-hearted. Really great stuff. It's on Munchies, which is owned by Vice, but just really good stuff.
Yeah, Maddie,
and Bon Appetit, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Bon Appetit, really good videos too.
I'm Maddie Matheson.
Anyway, so there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube that I genuinely enjoy watching, and like there's stuff that I learn a lot, right? Like Kurzgesagt and Veritasium and stuff like that. But there's like a ton of YouTube that I just like watch, and I don't get much out of it. But like the problem is if I'm not watching it, the friggin' red dot in the notification bar is telling me, or YouTube is telling me, hey, you're supposed to watch this, you're supposed to watch this. And I feel like I'm losing something by not watching it, and then I watch it and I don't gain anything. It's like poisonous. Is this what an addiction is? I don't know. I
think it's entirely possible. Like it's just that scratch that you can't really itch. I end up watching this channel called Gray Still Plays, And it's the guy who picks these simulator games like roller coaster simulators or farming simulators or medieval time simulators and just tries to break the game. And he does this. He does this over the span of like 15 minutes, and it's hilarious.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I end up watching a bunch of those, and then I'm like, oh, it's 2:00 in the morning now. This is not going to go well when I have to get up in like 4 hours.
YouTube does that a ton to me.
Yeah, it used to be Wikipedia. It used to be going down Wikipedia holes, and now it's just sitting there with a phone in my hand watching YouTube videos at 2:00 in the morning. Like, huh. So that's what happens when you build a bunch of roller coasters that can go past the speed of light. Oh. And then crash into all of the people that are like in the base of it trying to get on. Oh, look.
It sounds like Monster Factory, but
look, they're all in purgatory now.
For game design instead of character creation.
Basically, yes. Next question.
Thanks, dog.
Thank you, dog. From Don from Ohio. Dear Arif and Otto, because apparently I'm Otto now, is it realistic to think Mike Hughes will not be 100% until the 2020 season, since history dictates it takes a little over a year to fully recover from an ACL injury? What kind of impact do you see him having this year?
That I think is interesting because we've seen, and we're overexposed to a positive story with Adrian Peterson. I mean, and we've seen like players that rely on that need a cut, play at a high level right away. Jamal Charles, basically the same year, just got overshadowed by like the 2,000-yard season, right? As good evidence. But on the other end of the spectrum, Carson Wentz, if you believe he was good the year he almost won an MVP, his play in 2018 didn't match that, right? He's recovering from an ACL. And so if you've kind of got faith in his ability overall as a quarterback, you could say, hey, and I'm caveating this out because obviously I hate Carson Wentz, but you could say, hey, the 2018 season is not a good indicator of who he is because he had that ACL recovery problem. But what's interesting is there's a Football Outsider article that points to the starting velocity, I guess, and I'll link it in the show notes, the starting velocity of players on ACL recovery timeline. So if they tear their ACL before week 1, weeks 1 to 5, they return and are active week 1 over 65% of the time, something like that, which is not the same as playing at full strength or anything like that. But it's a good indicator. Whereas the later years, like if you tear your ACL week 6 to 10 or weeks 11 to 17, it's 50% and then like 3/8 or something like that after that. So when you tear the ACL is really important for how confident you can be on their play when they return. They've also got a database of all the people who've like torn their ACL and when they recovered and stuff like that. For someone like Sam Bradford, that obviously was a whole kind of set of injuries. Some players never played in the NFL again. But there are players that, returned right away and played pretty well. Like I think, Julian Edelman's a good example. He tore his ACL, I think, and then he missed the first 4 games because of a suspension. But, he played reasonably well, right, this season. Dalvin Cook, I thought, played really well. It took him a little bit, I guess, but I wouldn't say that he played poorly out the gate or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, like, there's a ton of examples of ACL injuries where players played pretty quickly and did well on return. So I would say that there's just a wide range of outcomes and that it's reasonable to expect Mike Hughes, who tore his ACL very early, to be able to play at a high level fairly early on. Maybe not week 1 necessarily, but very close to it.
All right, next from Don is also, can you name me a single, Dear Arif and Butters, can you name me a single food item a restaurant chain can make better than a local restaurant? Blooming Onion, and even so, that is trash.
See, I thought this was like name a single item that like a restaurant can make better than you can at home. And I was like, I can name like 80 items. What? But a restaurant chain versus like a restaurant. For a while, that answer used to be molten chocolate lava cakes. But that's no longer true. They figured out the secret, I guess. And because that used to be like proprietary IP protected stuff, how to make a molten chocolate lava cake. And it was very difficult for people to do. But now the recipe is out there and people know how to do it. So it's not that. But I think it's something like that, where a product that is better manufactured and then made essentially versus a product that's kind of made on demand. So I don't have a ton of examples quite off the top of my head.
I think I have two.
Okay, go for it.
And one of them is actually related to a binging with Babish episode where they determined that the chicken nuggets that you can get, like if you made them at home or something like that, are not the same and not as good as the chicken nuggets.
I saw that on a Brothers Green video. Yeah, that makes sense.
The chicken nuggets you get at McDonald's. So that might be one. But I was thinking,
but can a local restaurant? I don't think a local restaurant can do it because it's like difficult to access to the pink slurry that makes the chicken nuggets so delicious.
Exactly. All hail the pink slurry. I was thinking about this, and I think that I don't think I've had a better potato wedge, and attack me on Twitter. I don't think I've had a better potato wedge than KFC. And I've had
a lot. That's great. Go to Bobby and Steve's.
This is where I do like blind taste testing, and this becomes a thing. Like, I'm not entirely sure that I've had a better potato wedge than that, and I typically end up getting potato wedges. And
you should also check the Serious Eats on how to do crispy potatoes and potato wedges, because they've got a bunch of they've done a bunch of tests and they've got a bunch of secrets as to how you can make them better than the potato wedges you get at restaurants. So,
and actually, the drawing comically cookbook that I have, which is fantastic, which I highly recommend to people, has a really great potato wedge recipe in it that I've made for people, and I've certainly made for myself. I don't know if that's better. Wow. Now, that said, the soggy ones that taste terrible, that are either limp or overly fried, obviously terrible. But when it's on its game, it's certainly on its game.
I still think the potato wedges I'm serious, Bobby and Steve's are better. Bobby and Steve's is a full service gas station that happens to have like fried chicken and stuff. The one I don't know if all the Bobby and Steve's are the same, but the one that I always go to is like open at like 3 a.m. and that's the one like right next to the U of M campus on Washington, right off like 35.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Final question. Are Dear Arif and Snarf, how was Arif's trip to the furry convention in Orlando? As he said, Snarf.
Someone actually responded with a picture of Snarf from Thundercats. But like, I think from a different Thundercats. But yeah, I went to Disney World and I got a Yeti hat because in the Animal Kingdom, they have a Yeti ride, which I actually recommend. It's pretty good. And I had a Yeti hat, and for some reason, Don doesn't know what a furry is, I think. Seems to think that makes me a furry. But between the two of us, one of us has gone to a furry convention, and his name is not Arif. So
this is not when I come out or something, okay? To be fair.
It's a safe space, James. No judgment.
I DJ'd a wedding that was happening at the same time as a furry convention was happening, and
at the same I was just talking about passive voice wording like half an hour ago.
Yes.
Like, the media has been talking about Trey Wayne. No. At the same time as, that's a funny way of saying you participated in a furry convention.
I didn't say I participated in it. I just said things were seen. I thought it was funny as hell. I've been to random things like I once went with a girl to a paranormal convention just so I could just eat popcorn and watch the crazies. And let me tell you, it's totally worth it. If you ever get the chance to go there and just sit down with the Sasquatch like watchers, because they are hilarious.
The Sasquatchers?
Yes, the all female Sasquatch hunting team was there. The she squatches, they were there.
What a great name!
I know, right? I had a blast talking with them. I haven't smoked in years, but I wanted to just sit out there outside of the casino and just talk with them for hours and just smoking cigarettes and be like, so how close were you to the quote Bigfoot droppings? Well, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. No, I went. Well, you kind of have to go to it because the people who were having the wedding had the doors open, and so people in the outfits were walking into the wedding. Like they were walking into the wedding reception. It was, and the people there were like, "Oh, this is awesome! We have all this food. Eat." And so you have furries in have their heads off, sitting at tables and eating from the buffet, and and they're all like overly sweaty because they're in these gigantic heavy outfits. And
what everything. A great atmosphere, man! I mean, like it's easy to bag on furries, but like they're not hurting anyone.
No, they were just hungry and were curious and not being sexual at all. That I saw. So yeah, it was entertaining.
I'm told the Don's going to turn this into Arif as a furry. I'm told the vast majority of the furry stuff is not sexual at all. So, I'll believe them. They know better than me.
Until it is. All right.
Until it is. Then it's very that.
Yes. That is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Now that we've discussed furries and sexuality, Arif, what do you have to plug?
40 YouTube channels. No.
Hold on. Let me get my subscriptions up. First you want to do is First We Feast because Hot Ones is awesome. And then...
No, at The Athletic, there's a series of off-season questions that Chad and I are doing. You could say it's a roundtable, but it's just like the two of us. So like I guess not a live chat, but a discussion between the two of us on the 5 most pressing questions of the Vikings offseason. I think we just wrapped up question 4, which was about the biggest camp battles, which I already talked about. But there's discussions about whether or not the defense is going to be back and kind of what Kirk Cousins needs to do to be better and stuff like that. And then also I've got a piece coming up in the pipeline over at The Athletic about kind of the best plays to design for Cousins based off of kind of what he's done historically. And then, before training camp starts, we'll have released the training camp guide, which will be done exclusively through The Athletic. It's not going to be a PDF. There's going to be a landing page for it. Then you can click and go to the various parts. The quarterback scouting report. It's going to be a scouting report on all 86 non-specialists on the roster.
So there it is. The first announcement on Norse Code about the training camp guide. I was waiting for that. I was waiting to see if we were gonna have any official news on that. So
it is the season.
It is the season. That is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. My name is James. Thank you so much to Arif. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will hear from you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, hit people in the mouth.